Okay, so hello. We'll talk today about Paul Rudolph, and let's see just a second. So he was one of the United States leading architects of the modernist era. Paul Marvin Rudolph, born on October 23rd. We are one day late. Today is October 24th, 1918. He was known for his contributions to modernism throughout the later half of the 20th century. He served as the chair of Yale University School of Architecture for 6 years and famously designed the Yale Art and Architecture building, one of the earliest examples of brutalist architecture in the United States. But this word brutalist is a little bit questionable. Anyway, this is what he said. An architect is a man concerned with building meaningfully, as opposed to someone who is interested in building efficiently or sometimes even beautifully. We often apologize for being interested in meaningful buildings, but we do our profession an injustice in that way, probably. So he was searching for a meaningful architecture, although some people accuse him of being a little bit too conveniently graphic. His buildings are interesting, though, and they were interesting and they were acknowledged. Here was the man, Paul Rudolph, so born in 1918, so 104 years ago. Here he is in front of the Yale School of Art and Architecture that he designed and built. He was quite successful, and you see, as opposed to Tadao Ando, he uses concrete, which has a distinct tactility or tectonics. It's not smooth. It's quite the opposite. It has a texture and I would say a vigorous texture. Some drawings by Paul Rudolph. I think he drew well, and even if the drawing is precise, there is an atmosphere and certain lyricism. He designed many buildings and he built many buildings, and in a very heroic way. This one was built, for example, in Singapore, I think, one of his later works. I don't know if he worked himself on this rendering. Maybe he did. He liked to draw. I showed the drawing, but maybe someone else also contributed from his office. I don't know. Anyway, a believer in modernity, a believer in optimism in architecture. It was a different time, yes, then than now, but Paul Rudolph was a force at that time, and he had an immense success. Paul Rudolph, Dessin d'Architecture, architectural drawings. But this kind of architecture today maybe is not easily conceivable. Of course we can, but that state of mind, in the 60s or so, it's difficult to have today because we are confronted with all kinds of crises. Then there was almost like a rebirth after the Second World War, and the United States was doing well economically, and there was optimism and there was vigor. But today things are more complicated. Nevertheless, I think it's important to know his works because it's hard to do architecture without a form of optimism. Yes, he used a lot of concrete, maybe too much from our point of view, but at that time, just like in the case of Jean Renaudy, who also used concrete, at that time, there was no talk about pollution and so on. pencil drawing by Paul Rudolph. Okay, now we begin with maybe his first building or one of the very first, a residence. Of course, a young architect starts with small buildings. So he was actually very young, 22 now. He was born in 1918. So at 22, he designed the Atkinson's residence. Not a spectacular building, you know, but then even the beginnings of Le Corbusier are not very spectacular, more spectacular than this building by Paul Rudolph. But he was a student at the time and, you know, still reticent, still timid. But slowly he's becoming Paul Rudolph. Mr. Ralph Twitchell's residence, 1941. Here we see signs of modernity already. And again, this is 1941. So, you know, I'm not saying that it is necessarily a visionary building, but it has distinct signs of modernity. And the structure within the building is, you know, has a certain level of you know, visual interest, and you know, it is coherent, and he uses diagonals, which I like, and so on. So 1941, Paul Rudolph. Large surfaces of glass. For a one-floor building, it's okay. You can clean, you can, you know, clean the glass from the outside. You don't need scaffolding or anything. But you know, if the building had several floors, it would have been different. Anyway, an early building. So he was 23 years old when he designed this building. It looks like it's abandoned here. It's possible that it was abandoned and it maybe even vandalized a little bit. So what it says here, as of 1969, the owners were other people, sold in 2005 for an architect to an architect, damaged by fire. The house was dismantled and put into storage in 2007. The land was unbuilt as of 2013. Anyway, I usually don't like to read these texts. I place them on the PowerPoint presentation, but please allow me not to read them because it interrupts the fluidity of the presentation. This is a different building, but this is interesting too. Also, he was in his 20s, but you can see already that he's emancipated, you know, structurally and aesthetically, and this is going to be his trademark later on when he built much larger buildings. I like this building. You know, it's remarkably mature for someone who was only, I don't know, 23, 24 or so. Paul Rudolph. In the 60s and 70s and early 80s, the important architectural magazines were filled with the works by Paul Rudolph. He was one of the stars worldwide. But then with the arrival of postmodernism, his you know, power of seduction started to decrease a little bit, and you know, but I think it's important to know his works. 1967, so he was 28 years old, 29 years old when he designed this. This one already shows, so yeah, 67, no, he was, I counted wrongly. So he was born in 1918. So he was 39 years old when he designed this building, and it shows he already has success. He already the commissions began to flood him, and look at the building. You know, this is not compare it with the first building he built. It's a much more courageous building, and you know, the concerns with the aesthetics, with space, with the variety of views and so on is you know, actually, even for today, I think it's remarkable, the building. I personally am not a great fan of such large surfaces of glass, but again, at that time, and for an affluent client who had no problems to pay the electrical bills, I think it was okay. I wonder how Paul Rudolph would have built in the present. You know, we have to be careful even about the electricity, the amount of electricity we consume, the amount of energy we can afford to use, and so on. You know, it would be an interesting question. Paul Rudolph in 2022 or 2023, and so even such a, you know, opulent space for the living room today is problematic. You have to warm it now, you have to cool it in the summer. You need a lot of energy for such a big space. Now, of course, the very rich can afford it, but not everybody is rich, of course. Most people are not. Some towers, 1967, again, he was 39 in the Bronx. House 500 residents per tower. Look at them. And towers they are. I think they are well done. You know, all this concrete work is vigorous. Again, there was no talk of pollution at that time, but the buildings are, they are impressive. You know, the scale, the sculpturalness of the towers. 1967. Now 1968. So he was 40 years old. Another residence, a big one, but here he uses, you know, the slanted planes, which makes the building look like it was not built on the moon or on Mars. It could have been built. This one, of course, could accommodate very well photovoltaic panels here if it's oriented properly, and I believe it is towards south. I don't think he had here, you know, solar panels, but very easily it's almost inviting to have them. Of course, he built the building in this way, and it's interesting. It's you know, it's unconventional. It's resolute. It's refreshing in a way. Paul Rudolph at 40. So no, I'm wrong. At 50, he was born in 1918. I keep making mistakes in my simple arithmetics. He was 50, 1968. So he was born in 1918. A huge plot of land around this building. You wonder, you know, it's and without much landscape, you know, it's just a large piece of land on which this building landed. Beautiful flowers. Flowers are always beautiful. Now, 1970, at 52, another residence. This one also, kind of futuristic, if I am to describe it so. Another large building, another large house, another large private residence by Paul Rudolph. Sorry about the resolution of this picture. Not all pictures are great. This is a housing project, 1968. He built it, but I think it was demolished. Um, you know, for North Americans, this kind of communal living might be uncomfortable. They all almost look like they were made from, containers. But no, they were not made from containers. But that's how he imagined this community. And I think it was demolished, it was destroyed. 1989, the Paul Rudolph Ernest Wagner townhouse. He built a house for himself where now is the foundation, the Paul Rudolph Foundation in Manhattan, 246 East 58th Street. And I read that he had a hole through, it's a tall private residence, single building, but his office was there too, and he would have his private space at the top, but there was a continuum vertically between the floors, so with some holes in the floor, so he was able to see the activity of the office, from where he was at the top. Anyway, here is the building. In the drawing, seems to be taller. Probably he envisioned another floor, and maybe that floor was built actually. But it's interesting, even this building, if you compare it with the left and the right neighbors. Now, to have a building built for yourself, in Manhattan is quite something. I mean, you need to have the means to do so. You need the money. You see here, there is a continuum, vertical, and I like this fact that it's not a typical office. It's both a home and an office. I mean, in offices, you don't usually have, rugs and, this kind of art displayed, and the sofas and so on. Interesting. And now the Paul Rudolph Foundation is in this building after his death. No curtains at the windows. Another residence. Well, on top of an existing building, he built this one, also in Manhattan. Is it contextual? Not really. If it is contextual, is through opposition or through contrast. Harmony through contrast, not harmony through placid, mimicking, identification, and gentle cloning sometimes. What is this? It's a campus for students. Paul Rudolph, in what year? 1963. So he was 45 years old when he built this. No, he was quite vivacious through the way he used concrete, and I think he's convincing in some of his works. He's genuinely, interesting. Are those architecture students? It's possible, but they could just be students. But an inciting, exciting architecture stimulates, and the young, I think, are modeled, are by the environment they live in, and it's important to be able to, of course, these were, rich campuses, and they had big budgets, and, to hire an important architect to build for them, but it's important. It is important. So this was, almost 60 years ago, more than 50 years ago. I like the fact that he also paid attention to what was around the buildings, the landscaping and those platforms. And so, there was a dynamic architecture. It is a dynamic architecture where he thought about everything as it should be. Now a governmental building, 1963, Orange County. I like this building. It's in Los Angeles, I imagine. That's where Orange County is. And, a governmental building usually is rather predictable architecturally, and, showing a monolithic force. But in this case, you'll see it has a fragmentation. You begin to have an idea when you contemplate the plan, and this actually erodes the idea that a governmental building should be monolithic, expressing authority, and so on. And I like this fact that Paul Rudolph tried to show the multitude, not just the king, but also, the people for whom the king was supposed to work. And I'm referring here with the word the king to, to the authority of the government. Anyway, you'll see these are his drawings in section are typically like this, where he also shows, the shadows within the perspectival section or sectional drawing. Now, today you can use, softwares that generate sections automatically with or without shadows. But at that time, everything was done manually, like this drawing. And I remember seeing his work published in architectural magazines. I admire these perspectival sections because you perceive differently, space. And when you have also the shadows, this gives more reality to an otherwise technical drawing. And here it is. I think it's a good building, and I like I like this fact that it has this its fragmentation, if I am to call it so, towards the outside. So it's not an oppressive building, you know, like so many governmental buildings are. Let's reflect on Casa Poporului, you know, in Bucharest. You know, this is as a different spirit. It has force, but it's not an oppressive force. And I think because of this dynamic conjunction of various parts that come together for the common good, in essence. And that's what a governmental building should be, and that's what a government should be, you know, for the common good. There are all kinds of things happening here, some more dramatic than others, but I like this building. Building for the government. In more recent times, I would say Morphosis and Tom Main probably built, I know of one case, one instance where they built, you know, courageously and unconventionally for the federal building, also on the west coast in San Francisco. It seems that somehow California is more open to experiments, even in the field of federal buildings or federal architecture. Even the interior, I think it has a certain drama, you know, the way the light pierces the building and the shadows and various floors and the continuous space. And, you know, some people call it brutalist architecture. I actually wrote a kind of a manifesto just 2 days ago towards a gentle brutalism. I know it's a paradox, I know it's an oxymoron, but I think it is possible to have a gentle brutalism, because what appears to be brutal is not always brutal in the literal sense. Behind the appearance might be a certain gentleness of the state of the mind of the creator, and that could be discerned, and could be discovered, and could be felt. Another space for the arts, 1963, 1966, Center for Colgate University. No, he is not, he was not, and he is not an architect to ignore. Yesterday, talking about Jean Renaudy, I talked a lot about diagonals and triangles, because the housing complexes that Jean Renaudy built worked abundantly with triangles and you know, dynamic configurations resulting from using diagonals and the triangle. And I'm even thinking of initiating a festival of the diagonal, or the festival of the oblique, in February next year, because there will be 100 years since the birth of an architect who was almost obsessed by what is oblique or the diagonal. That is the French architect Claude Parent. I want to do it. I already wrote a text about it, but who knows if I will find people interested to explore the potential, the potentialities, the expressiveness of the diagonal. Anyway, this is another building for the arts built by the, it's for a educational purpose, for a campus, but Paul Rudolph is showing again, a desire for a vivacious architecture, for an architecture that doesn't leave you indifferent, an architecture that, if he's unable to sing, at least is willing to talk. But I imagine he wanted to make it to sing. Like Paul Valéry said, that a true architect should make a building sing. Now, you like this music or not, this remains to be discussed. But the attempt is here to make a building, that doesn't leave you indifferent. And yes, culturalness is part of what architecture often relies on, because the play of light and shadow is more exciting where the building does have sculptural qualities. But I would notice again the fragmentation, as I call it, that he is not happy to just have a monolithic building. He wants to bring in some sensitivity. And I also like the fact that he doesn't use smooth concrete. And you see here the texture of his concrete. Inside, but I like the fact that he doesn't hide it between plaster or anything. You can see, the traces of the woodwork used for creating the concrete work. Christian Science Center, a religious building this time, but modern through and through, sculptural, vigorous, but not arrogantly so, I would say. Where is it? I don't say, but anyway, Paul Rudolph. And again, his trademark concrete. Christian Science Organization. He probably designed the door as well. Quite Baroque. The truth is, architecture benefits from freedom of expression and benefits from having clients who collaborate with you and are willing to trust you. And then there is a chance that a good building comes into being. Now, a large building for the Boston Government Service Center, an initial sketch, pencil drawing. Again, the Baroque outside of the building, the stepped landscaping around the building, a staircase, or what is it here? You will see the building, it was built and it's huge. And I would say it's an interesting building. And again, I'm happy it's here. I find it stimulating that he didn't just create a building and then left the outside. No, the outside in the vicinity of the building is itself part of the whole work. So the outside and the inside collaborate to create a unified but not boringly so experience. And look at again, I like very much, how he created this, for that time, I think was rather unique. you know, maybe today where we have fluid architecture, so on, parametric design, it's more common perhaps. But at that time, you know, look at this stair. This is Baroque. And the building is modern, but the landscaping outside is, in fact, is a transition from the building towards the green, if there is any green. Maybe there isn't much except the trees here. Um, this space, this courtyard, is architecturally significant, just as Campidoglio in Rome is for the buildings that surround it. And Michelangelo was inspired to make it architecturally significant. The buildings are, you know, large, and this is a picture taken from rather, you know, I don't know what's happening here. It looks like a deserted, the back of the building or something, but you'll see the whole thing. It's Boston. It's a big city and it's a big building for the government. Paul Rudolph. Now, maybe it would have benefited from more vegetation, as even texture, the concrete is still concrete. I think it would have been nice if the building was attacked by ivy to have a lot of green on this concrete. It can still be done. I think I read that you know, not everybody was happy with this building, and there were even some complaints, because not everybody likes you know, the austerity of concrete. Even here there is a gesture towards sensualizing the concrete through the texture, but it's still concrete. Essentially, it's a cold material. It's not a warm material. Now we arrive at a very famous work by him, the Yale Art and Architecture building in Connecticut for Yale University, and he was dean there for 6 years, as we read. I visited actually this building. So it's not just for architecture, and it's not just for art. It's for both, for art and architecture. And very often art and architecture come together, in the sense that yes, there is an and, art and architecture, but why do they come together? Because they are related. Architecture is not quite art, but it could be art. And that's why we see often art and architecture. Although there is a school of architecture in New York, a very famous one, Cooper Union, which has 3 schools within. One is for painting, one for architecture, and one for engineering. Very interesting conjunction between 3 different schools. This is the plan of the Yale Art and Architecture building in Connecticut. So we are now on the east coast of the United States. The building was considered revolutionary, but seen from today doesn't look so revolutionary. I mean, we had seen buildings much more outrageous than this one is. You know, it's a modern building done by an architect of talent, but rich university, Yale University, of course. Now, I don't know what's going on here. Maybe just like Louis Kahn, he enclosed some technical spaces, I don't know, pipes or whatever. It's possible, or maybe not. Again, the typical section through a building by Paul Rudolph, where the light and the shadow modulate the interior in visible ways. This was an interesting exhibition. I look at the poster, Archaeology of the Digital. It's a paradoxical title, no? The exhibition was organized, and I think maybe it was even a book published by Greg Lynn, The Archaeology of the Digital. The picture was taken probably, I don't know, at least 15 years ago, if not 20. So this is the building, the School of Art and Architecture at Yale University. Here he is. Paul Rudolph. His trademark concrete. I wonder what Tadao Ando would think or thought of this manner of treating concrete, so very different from his. Now, a chapel for the School of Theology at Emory University. I think it's rather interesting, yeah. I mean, it is a religious building. We see the cross, but the building here has, there is something unusual about this building. Almost a certain, I don't know. It's possible that he had to accommodate certain functions. Maybe certain parts of the building. Here I see something, maybe an existing building, but all in all, it's not bad. And I like the fact that a religious order accommodates, accepts, or maybe even invites modern architecture within a campus, which you see all these buildings have sloping roofs. So, these are, so-called traditional buildings all around it. But Paul Rudolph did his work in his own way, and nobody protested. Quite the opposite, perhaps. They encouraged him and invited him. And I don't know why. I mean, I know why, but I think the architects should protest in our country, because we allow the church to, avoid, creativity in architecture. And it's doing a disservice not just to architecture, but to culture in general, and I would say even to spirit, to religion, because I do believe that if man is created in, resembling God, and if God was creative and is creative, then man should be creative too. But the Orthodox Church thinks otherwise, at least in our country. In other countries, even the Orthodox Church is more courageous. Like in New York City, the Greek Orthodox Church commissioned Calatrava to build a building not far away from where the World Trade Center was. I like this sketch by Paul Rudolph. You see the minuteness, it's a sensitive drawing, but it's also, you can tell he was concerned with the accuracy of dimensions, and so it was not just a play with forms. No, Paul Rudolph was a good architect. Who talks today about Paul Rudolph? We are probably, I don't want to say we are the only ones, but I don't think too many people. And I think the students should know this work. Especially these works, he built, as far as I know, 2 religious buildings or for a religious function. They are not, I didn't know of them until I began to work on the presentation. And I was surprised in a good way. I was pleased to discover them. Well, a good architect, as you know, is a good architect, doesn't matter what he or she does, a fence, a pavilion, a room, or a city. A good architect is a good architect in whatever he or she does. But I like these buildings by Paul Rudolph. Oh, I don't know what this yin and yang is here. I see it here too. Maybe it's just, I don't know, but it's a nice section through this building. It doesn't want to impress through being very spectacular, but and he was not a very, I mean, I don't know, maybe in the United States this is not an issue, but he was not a heterosexual. So, you know, he was openly not a heterosexual, and, you know, but then Michelangelo was not either. And, you know, the church was not affected by it, and we are glad it was not affected by it. The importance is to be given to the work, to the quality of the work. And Paul Rudolph tried his best, and so did, of course, Michelangelo. Now, another chapel from 1960, so he was 42 years old. This one, again, you know, it's I'm curious what the what the father of the church here would think about such a building. You know, the building is probably too predictably modern, but it has a vigor, and maybe, you know, someone could ask, why should a religious building have vigor? It might be a good question. Anyway, when you see it, even if you don't see the cross, although it's hard not to see it, but if the cross was not there, you probably would have thought that, yes, it should be kind of a church or a chapel. And that's what it is. Again, I like, in the case of Paul Rudolph, how he takes care of the space around the building. The building is as it is, but then he also creates, you know, this transition between his building and what is further away from this building through these intermediate spaces, platforms, and you know, the Baroque almost configurations for the stairs. We see here clearly the rigor, you know, it is a system, but there is a certain organicity and even something ornamental about this very precise rigor. Space analysis of this building. I don't know who did this. I don't think he did it. Anyway. From the outside, the building seems to be a little bit, I wish I would have seen some of the sensuality of the plans, also a little bit on the facades, and they are not so visible, but maybe walking around the building, you perceive what we saw in the plans. Although in this picture, so I don't quite see it. It's a rather large chapel. I don't think this is one of his best works, but anyway, the colonnade, Singapore. Here he built dramatic towers for this Switzerland of Southeast Asia, because this is what Singapore is. I was told by an architect from Indonesia with whom I became friends. He was here. He and his wife even made presentations here on the Zoom platform, and they won a few months ago the competition to build a house, in fact, the palace of the vice president of Indonesia, a huge building on top of a hill. Anyway, back to Paul Rudolph. I like this drawing too. Again, this is a rather sensitive drawing done with a pencil or maybe some kind of ink device. I don't know. The structure is very rigorous and regular, but the labyrinth that he creates seems to say something else. And you will see the building soon. So let's see how many apartments are here. I see one apartment, maybe two apartments. I know that in our country, bathrooms exposed like this in the facade of the building and the exterior walls are discouraged. But I saw many examples, even by famous architects, like in this case, where they have no problem at all to bring the bathroom, in fact, almost ostentatiously, like this one is in the corner, this one is, maybe it's even cantilevered or something. So I don't know. I mean, certain dogmas of, I understand the reason, because when the construction is not, very well done, there could be some problems. But the pudicity of, I don't know, hearing, I don't know what kind of noises, I don't think that's really a problem. But anyway. One thing is for sure, something like this would be discouraged in some schools of architecture. And as you can see, Paul Rudolph didn't have a problem with it at all. And he built these towers, and towers they are. The renderings of his office are quite good, and they were done not digitally, but manually. Drawings. It would be interesting, perhaps, to compare the drawings of Paul Rudolph with the drawings of Frank Lloyd Wright. They are very different architects, but there is a certain sensitivity, particularly in the pencil drawings, that makes me think a little bit of Wright, although Wright would have built differently, of course, and in a different period of time. Anyway, not so much this drawing. And here it is, the big building in Singapore, a luxurious tower, of course, for those who can afford to live here. But Singapore has money, and there are people there with the necessary millions of dollars to purchase an apartment here. Here and in other buildings built by notorious architects these days, I almost said Switzerland, in Singapore, which was described to me as being the Switzerland of Southeast Asia. Now, of course, you need some money in order to, make this space livable in the summer and in the winter. You need a lot of energy to warm it up and also to cool it off. But someone who can buy an apartment here can pay the bills too. Office and shopping complex, also in Singapore, 1981, 1994. we are approaching the end of the presentation and the end of his life, actually. He built it. Some people accuse Paul Rudolph for being a little bit too graphic. And it's true, there is a certain predictability in a way. But all in all, I think he was an architect who, at least in some works, was significant and important. Again, if we look at this drawing from the top, from the air, you know, we see the fragmentation of the monolith, which I noticed in other buildings like that governmental building in Orange County and so on. And I think this was the quality of his work, that he didn't just use, you know, monolithic buildings, but he tried to problematize them through what I call fragmentation, like here. You know, it works like a whole, like a unique building, but this unique building is actually made up of various units. And you look how he, you know, this is an apartment, but between this apartment and the other apartment, there is this, you know, excavation within the larger building. So essentially, you have here 6 buildings united by a core with elevators and staircases, but there are 6 buildings, but there are also 1 building. And this is very interesting. You have multiplicity in unity. And this is, I think, very important to try to achieve in architecture. Now, the architectural language is perhaps a little bit simplistically modernistic, maybe even a little bit, you know, maybe even a little, it depends on the taste, you know, maybe a little bit oppressive, but there are interesting things. And I would still stress this fact that he achieved multiplicity in unity, at least at the level of the plan. I'm not so, personally, I'm not so, you know, favorably oriented towards the aesthetics of the outside. I mean, they are okay perhaps, but I'm not very moved. I like more that chapel that he built, the first one that I showed, than this work. Now, this is an interesting residence built for if I remember, for you know, an engineer who was a pilot or worked in aviation. Anyway, he built this this building, a large residence, with a certain sense of drama, architectural drama. And yeah, it's a big building and so on. I like the look at this drawing, you know, it's very descriptive, it's very accurate, very rigorous. And yet I think it has a certain sensitivity. It's not just a technical drawing, although in essence it is a technical drawing. He liked diagonals as well, as you can see. And he was inspired by the industrial landscape, if I am to call it so. There were all the industrial buildings in the vicinity of what he proposed. And this is a picture with such buildings. And then the building somehow tried to connect both with what the client was doing in his life. So in a way, it's also a narrative architecture to an extent, and also, you know, connect somehow with industrial processes, with the vicinity, with the buildings not far away from this house. It's an interesting approach, and I mean, yes, it's a big building, but I like the fact that it doesn't look like it's a residence, but it doesn't look like a residence. It looks like it could almost have a public function of some sort. It's not very large, it's not very huge. I mean, it is big, but I like this ambiguity, you know, that it is a house, but it doesn't quite look like a house or just like a house. And the inspiration, I don't know if this was his work or his, you know, decision to use these rocks here, but they look good in the picture because you know, the building doesn't have what the rocks have, and the rocks don't have what the building has. He was a creative architect, you know, and no one can deny it. Hong Kong, 1984, 1988, the Bond Center, Repo Center. Hong Kong, which a few days ago I learned that has the longest life expectancy in the world. On the second place is Japan, but on the first place in the world is Hong Kong. They live the longest. Although from what I listened on the French radio station, they are very unhappy now because China restricts all the freedoms they had. It used to be a rebellious city, Hong Kong, and now there is no room for rebellion, for being rebellious. So many people are very unhappy in Hong Kong right now. But they still manage to be on top of the list with the, you know, the longest, the highest life expectancy. And the buildings go high as well, don't they? We see maybe it's a facile architecture to an extent, the playfulness with the volumes. There is a homo ludens here that is perhaps too obvious, but a little bit but he was getting old, and I am not trying to excuse him. I still think the buildings are not, you know, the worst towers I have seen. But I mean, you know, you look at this, you know, it's rather facile, but you know, he creates some kind of a ornamental design with, you know, I mean, there are here, I don't know, it's just one floor or 3 floors. Anyway, this is a monumental scale, and the capriciousness of ornament adds something to the towers. These are very, you know, they are for a mega city, for a metropolis. They are huge buildings. And again, the attempt to fragment the monolithic towers, it's positive. Now, if he did it in a very, it's a little bit predictable because you see the system. But, you know, the system is to be seen also in many, you know, ornaments or decorations as well. Otherwise, the buildings are not so unique. A lot of glass, and I mean, after all, between this building, which is not his, and this building is not such a huge, or this one. This, I would say, is the limit of the project, but still, they still have a you know, a certain individuality, moderate individuality, I would say. And sometimes you can take interesting pictures like here. If this announcement, this banner was not here, it would have been even better. But maybe I'm too much of a purist now. Anyway, another building in the late years of creativity of Paul Rudolph. Indonesia, 1994. Here he was inspired by traditional houses, old houses in in Indonesia. Indonesia has some very interesting old architecture and some new architecture as well. What was very interesting was that 2 years ago, when on Indonesia Day, because I became friends with those Indonesian architects who, for some reason, entered this Zoom platform, but they were educated in Rotterdam at Berlage Institute, and one was German anyway. And now they are in Indonesia. But what was interesting is that I presented myself as an homage to Indonesian architecture, a bamboo school, which I liked, that I was just published everywhere on the web, and probably not only on the web. And while I was presenting the building here on Zoom, someone said, I am the architect of that school. So it happened that without knowing, I didn't know who he was. It just happened that he took part here on Zoom, and then he told us a few things about the building and so on. A very nice, ad hoc, intervention. Now, this residence from 1998, I like very much that this very successful architect, and aware of his success, dedicated himself to build a house in what looks like a poor neighborhood in the United States. In what city? It doesn't say here, but I look at these houses here. This is not a rich neighborhood at all. And Paul Rudolph, the big architect, if I can call him so, accepted the invitation to build a house here. I like this. I like the fact that a famous architect who built for the government, for Singapore, towers and towers going all the way up to God, also found energy and interest to build probably a modest house, a small house for his standards, near other small houses in what looks like a neglected neighborhood somewhere in the States. And this is the house. It's not bad. It's yes, it's a little bit misanthropic because of these blank walls here. It's something almost Japanese. It's almost like a bunker, But I look at the car and I know this is a poor neighborhood. And Paul Rudolph built this house here for someone, not for himself. I mean, you look at the fence here, my God, I like this fact that it's even possible was not inhabited or was, I don't know what, because I see here, it looks like the glass was broken, and nevertheless, it's a building by Paul Rudolph. So in the 1990s, in the last decade of his life, Rudolph explored the application of traditional building forms with his modernist aesthetic in large-scale projects in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Indonesia. In 1997, Paul Rudolph passed away in New York City from mesothelioma, a cancer that usually results from exposure to asbestos. At the time of his death, he was working on plans for a new town of 250,000 people in Indonesia and a private residence, chapel, and office complex in Singapore. This is the town he was working on when he died in what year? 1997. So I show some drawings, some plans that he made for this, for Indonesia, for this town, for, a 250,000 people. And with this, I will end this homage to him, this presentation to him. So again, a good architect can design a room and can design a house and can design a cluster of buildings on the street and can design a city. And here we see Paul Rudolph as an urbanist. And yes, a good urbanist is also a good architect, and a good architect is a good urbanist. Although, yes, urbanism has its own, rules and regulations, its own problems. But from the point of view of the essence of architecture, good architects were also involved in what we call urbanism, sometimes successfully, sometimes less successfully. Everybody blames now Le Corbusier for his Ville Radieuse project, but you know, he made a proposal. And Frank Lloyd Wright, also who didn't have commissions for about 10 years, he worked on Broadacre City. What I'm trying to say is that an architect who loves architecture and dedicates himself or herself to architecture does everything, you know, designs a chair, even a toy, a watch like Aldo Rossi. We talked about Aldo Rossi at the beginning. You design a city. Aldo Rossi also was interested in the urban art, in urbanism. And here we see Paul Rudolph also assuming a large plot of land for 250,000 people. And that's it. So let's wish him happy birthday for October 13th, although today is 10 days later. Of course, he died in 1997. So we are, you know, 25 years later and 10 days later. Thank you.